Barron Trump had always lived in the shadow of his family name. The world saw him as the son of a powerful man, but he wanted to be more than that. He wanted to prove that his intelligence, his abilities, and his future were his own. That's why he chose to enroll at a prestigious university known for its rigorous academic standards and some of the toughest professors in the country. Among them was Dr. Malcolm Graves, a legend in the world of mathematics. He was known for his brilliance, but also for his ruthless teaching style. Students feared his class, not just because calculus was difficult, but because Graves had a reputation for breaking students down. He had little patience for those he deemed unworthy of higher mathematics. And as soon as he saw Barron Trump's name on his class roster, he made up his mind. Barron didn't belong. The lecture hall was packed. Hundreds of students filled the room, murmuring about the infamous Dr. Graves. Some had studied his published papers. Others had heard horror stories about how he had destroyed confident students with just a few well-placed questions. Barron sat quietly in the second row, his posture straight, his eyes focused. He knew what people thought of him. Some assumed he was there because of his last name. Others whispered that he'd drop out within weeks. But he had spent the summer preparing. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially a bitter professor, define his worth. Dr. Graves entered the room with a slow, deliberate stride. He was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a dark suit. His piercing eyes scanned the students, and when they landed on Barron, his lips curled into a slight smirk. "Welcome to Calculus 3, he said, his voice smooth but commanding. "Some of you will thrive in this class. Most of you will struggle, and a few of you, well, you'll realize you were never meant to be here in the first place." Barron didn't flinch. Graves picked up a piece of chalk and turned to the massive blackboard behind him. Without hesitation, he wrote a long, complicated equation. It stretched across the board, filled with symbols and variables that made several students widen their eyes in alarm. Then Graves turned back to the class and smiled. "Who among you is brave enough to solve this?" Silence. The air grew thick with tension. Students exchanged nervous glances, some shrinking into their seats. They all knew what this was. A trap. It was a test designed to humiliate whoever dared to step forward. Then slowly Barron stood up. A whisper ran through the room. Some students looked amused, others surprised. Graves arched an eyebrow, as if he had expected Barron to stay quiet. "Well," Graves said, stepping aside, "by all means, enlighten us." Barron walked to the board with steady steps. He picked up the chalk and examined the equation. His mind raced, breaking it down into smaller parts, looking for patterns. He had studied problems like this before. He knew there was a trick hidden within it. Dr. Graves watched, arms crossed, waiting for the moment when Barron would freeze, stumble, or make a fool of himself. But Barron didn't. He began writing. Piece by piece, he solved the equation, his handwriting clear and confident. At one point, he paused, considering the next step. The room was silent. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He adjusted his approach, refining his calculations. 5 minutes passed, then 10. And then it was done. Barron put down the chalk and stepped back. The solution was correct. The class sat in stunned silence. A few students leaned forward, checking the board, their eyes widening as they saw that Barron Trump had just solved one of Dr. Graves' infamous, impossible problems. Dr. Graves' face remained neutral, but his eyes darkened slightly. He stepped toward the board, as if searching for a mistake. But there was none. Finally, he turned to Barron. "You've been studying," he said quietly. Barron nodded. "Yes, sir." There was something in Barron's voice, a quiet confidence. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't trying to prove anything to Graves. He had simply done the work. The professor narrowed his eyes. This was not over. "Interesting," Graves said, stepping away from the board. "But solving one problem doesn't make you a mathematician." He turned back to the class. "Let's see how long he lasts." Barron returned to his seat, ignoring the stares from his classmates. He knew what had just happened. He had earned Graves' attention, but not his respect. That would be much harder to win. And so the battle had begun. Dr. Malcolm Graves was not a man who liked to lose. And though he had never openly admitted it, Barron Trump had beaten him that day. The young man had walked into his class, solved an impossible equation in front of hundreds of students, and left without looking shaken or overwhelmed. That was a problem. Graves had spent years shaping his reputation. He was the professor who humbled the arrogant, who exposed the weak, who forced students to realize that intelligence was earned, not inherited. But now a young man with a famous last name had just disrupted his entire system. That couldn't be allowed. So the real battle began. Over the next few weeks, Graves made sure Barron knew he was being watched. Every class, Graves would call on him, always with the hardest questions, always without warning. He would demand answers before Barron had time to think, hoping to catch him off guard. Most students would crumble under the pressure. Barron did not. He had learned to expect it. Every night he studied longer, preparing for every possible question. He understood that Graves wasn't just testing his math skills, he was testing his mind. And so every time the professor turned to him with a smug expression, waiting for him to fail, Barron would answer, calmly and correctly. The class began to notice. At first, some students had whispered about how Barron was doomed, that Graves would tear him apart. But now they whispered something different. Was Barron Trump actually smarter than Graves had thought? Despite his success in class, Barron knew he needed help. He wasn't just up against a tough course. He was in a personal war with a professor who wanted to see him fail. So, one evening, after an exhausting lecture, Barron walked into the old university library, searching for someone he had heard rumors about. There, in a quiet corner filled with dusty books and ancient equations, sat Professor Elliot Wren. Wren was a retired mathematician, once considered a genius, now mostly forgotten. He was known for his strange teaching methods and his refusal to conform to modern academic standards. Some said he had been just as ruthless as Graves once, but something had changed him. Barron approached the old man's desk. "Professor Wren?" The old man looked up. He had deep-set eyes, a messy beard, and an expression that seemed both tired and amused. "Ah," Wren said, "the Trump boy." Barron stiffened. "I prefer Barron." Wren chuckled. "And I prefer a quiet library. Yet here we are." Barron wasn't in the mood for games. "I need help. Graves, he's trying to break you," Wren finished. "Yes, I know." Barron narrowed his eyes. "And you're not surprised?" "Not in the slightest," Wren said, leaning back. "Graves was my student once. Brilliant mind, but arrogant. He believes intelligence is about power, about proving who is superior." Barron frowned. "So what do I do?" The old professor smiled. "You don't beat him at his own game. You change the rules." Barron sat down. "How?" Wren reached into a stack of papers and pulled out an old yellowed notebook. He slid it across the table. "Start here," he said. Barron opened it and saw pages filled with strange symbols and notations. It wasn't just calculus. It was something deeper, something different. "This isn't normal math," Barron muttered. "No," Wren said. "It's the philosophy behind math. And if you understand that, Graves won't be able to touch you." While Barron studied under Wren in secret, Graves was preparing his next attack. He had realized that simple tricks, calling on Barron, giving him difficult problems, weren't working. So he decided to up the stakes. One afternoon, he walked into the lecture hall and, without saying a word, began writing a new equation on the board. It was far beyond the course level. Even students who had aced the last test felt their stomachs drop as they tried to make sense of it. Graves turned to face the class. "Whoever can solve this problem," he said smoothly, "will receive an automatic A on the next exam." A wave of murmurs spread through the room. That was unheard of. Graves never handed out free grades. Then he smiled. "And of course, I expect Barron to try first." Silence. Barron, sitting in the second row, didn't react. He knew what this was. Graves wanted him to fail publicly. He wanted him to choke in front of everyone, to prove that Barron's earlier successes were just luck. For the first time, Barron hesitated. This equation was unlike anything he had seen in the textbook. It looked wrong. Was it even solvable? His heart pounded. He knew that if he stepped forward and failed, Graves would finally get what he wanted. But then, a thought came to him. Wren's words from the night before. "You don't beat him at his own game." You changed the rules. Barron slowly stood up. He didn't walk to the board. Instead, he folded his arms and looked directly at Graves. This problem is incorrect, he said. The class gasped. Graves' eyes flashed. Excuse me? There's an error in the setup, Barron continued, pointing to a part of the equation. It's unsolvable as written. The room fell completely silent. Graves stared at him. For a moment, Barron wondered if he had made a mistake. Then, to his surprise, Graves smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something colder, more dangerous. So, the professor said, his voice smooth, you're learning. Barron didn't respond. He knew what this meant. Graves wasn't backing down. He was just getting started. And the real war had only begun. For the first time, Barron had put Dr. Graves on the defensive. By pointing out the flaw in the professor's unsolvable equation, he had done something no student had ever dared. He challenged Graves in his own domain, and Graves hated it. From that day forward, the battle between them became more than just about calculus. It became a war of psychology, pressure, and control. Graves stopped giving Barron straightforward problems. Instead, he manipulated the way he asked questions, setting up traps, forcing Barron to second-guess himself. He mocked Barron's answers, even when they were correct, scoffing as if they were unimpressive. Acceptable, he would say, shrugging, but hardly brilliant. When Barron provided an answer faster than expected, Graves ignored it entirely, moving on as if nothing had been said. And when Barron hesitated, even for a second, Graves pounced. Ah, the professor would say, smirking, I see you're struggling. Perhaps it's best if someone else answers. The class watched silently, some in awe of Barron's resilience, others wondering how long he could last. But Barron didn't break, because he understood what was happening. This wasn't about calculus anymore. It was a mental war. Outside the classroom, the whispers about Barron grew louder. Some students respected him. Others thought he was being foolish, and some simply enjoyed the spectacle, watching the arrogant professor and the quiet Trump kid go head-to-head. Even professors from other departments began attending Graves' lectures, curious about the student who refused to back down. The pressure was immense, and Barron started feeling it. His nights became longer, his study sessions with Professor Wren more intense. You look exhausted, Wren said one evening, watching Barron rub his eyes. Barron sighed. I don't have a choice. Wren leaned back in his chair. You do? Barron frowned. What's that supposed to mean? You can walk away, Wren said simply. Drop the class. Graves wins, you move on, and life continues. Barron stiffened. That's not an option. Wren studied him for a moment, then chuckled. Good, the old mathematician said, tossing a thick book onto the table. Then let's make sure you don't just survive. Let's make sure you win. Barron realized that responding to Graves's attacks directly wasn't working. If he played by the professor's rules, Graves would always have the advantage. So he changed the rules. The next time Graves called on him unexpectedly, Barron didn't rush to answer. Instead, he paused, thought. Then when he spoke, he explained the entire process. Not just the answer, but the reasoning, the approach, the deeper logic behind it. He spoke so clearly, so confidently, that Graves couldn't interrupt. He didn't just answer the question. He taught the entire class, and students started noticing something. Barron wasn't just keeping up with Graves anymore. He was outthinking him. The shift in power was subtle, but it was there. The classroom dynamic was changing. Graves' mind games weren't working like before, but instead of backing down, he escalated. The public humiliation attempt. One afternoon, Graves walked into class with a plan. He turned to the students, his expression unreadable. Mathematics, he said slowly, is not just about solving equations. It is about proving truth. He turned to Barron. So today, I have a different challenge. The class tensed. Graves wrote an entire theorem on the board, a complex, unproven statement that even professional mathematicians struggled with. Then he stepped back and crossed his arms. Prove it, he said to Barron. A murmur ran through the class. This wasn't just difficult. This was impossible. Barron felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. Graves was going for the kill shot. He wanted Barron to stand there, frozen, humiliated, unable to answer. For the first time, Barron wondered if this was too much. But then something inside him shifted. He didn't panic. He didn't try to solve the impossible. Instead, he turned to Graves. "This is outside the course material," Barron said calmly. "You're not asking me to solve a problem. You're trying to humiliate me." Graves smirked. "Are you refusing?" "No," Barron said, shaking his head. "I'm calling you out." The room went silent. Some students gasped. Graves' smirk faltered for half a second. Barron turned back to the board. "This theorem hasn't been proven because it requires an assumption about an undefined variable," he said, underlining a key part of the equation. "In other words, this problem doesn't test intelligence. It tests whether someone is willing to waste their time on an impossible task." Barron put the chalk down and turned back to the professor. "Did I pass your test?" The class erupted. Some students clapped. Others whispered furiously. Even the other professors in the back exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Graves had failed. For the first time, he had set up a trap, and Barron had walked right over it. The professor's jaw tightened. Then slowly he turned back to the board and erased the theorem. "No matter," Graves said, voice even. "We'll move on." But everyone in that room knew the truth. Barron had won that round, and Graves would not forget it. The real test was still coming, and it would be much, much worse. The lecture hall was still buzzing after Barron's public defiance of Dr. Graves. No student had ever done what he did, not just answering Graves, but turning the challenge back on him. Whispers spread across campus. Professors from other departments discussed it in their offices. Students who had never cared about calculus suddenly wanted to attend Graves' lectures just to see what would happen next. But Graves was not the type of man to let something go. He had been humiliated, and now he had one goal: to break Barron Trump completely. Over the next few weeks, Barron noticed a shift. Graves no longer called on him in class. No more public challenges, no more tricks. Instead, something more subtle began to happen. One by one, students who had once sat next to Barron moved away. People who used to ask him for help stopped talking to him. He noticed the way his name was mentioned in whispers, the way certain professors looked at him with something like caution or even fear. Graves was using a different tactic now. He was isolating Barron, and it was working. Barron had always been independent, but this was different. It was one thing to handle pressure in a classroom. It was another to feel completely alone. Even his study sessions with Professor Wren grew tense. "You seem distracted," Wren observed one evening. Barron shook his head. "It's nothing." Wren sighed. "No, it's Graves. He's doing what he does best, getting inside your head." Barron didn't respond, because deep down, Wren was right. One night, Barron received an unexpected email. Anonymous sender, no subject. Inside, just one sentence: "Drop the class while you still can." Barron stared at the screen. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But something about the timing, right when Graves had stopped challenging him, made it clear. This wasn't a student prank. This was a warning, and it was meant to scare him. Instead of replying, Barron shut his laptop and headed straight for Wren's office. It was past midnight, but the old professor was still there, buried in papers and books. He looked up when Barron entered. "I assume this is important," Wren said. Barron showed him the email. The old man sighed. "It started." "What started?" Barron asked. "The real game," Wren said, folding his hands. "Graves has tested your intelligence, your confidence, and your ability to think under pressure. None of it worked. So now he's trying the last tactic he has left." "Fear?" Barron said. Wren nodded. Barron leaned against the desk. "I don't get it. Why is he doing this? Why does he care so much?" Wren studied him carefully, then spoke. "Because you weren't supposed to survive." Barron frowned. "Graves builds his reputation by breaking students who think they're untouchable," Wren continued. "He's done it for years. But you didn't break. You fought back. And worse, you're winning." Barron exhaled slowly. "So what do I do?" Wren leaned forward. "You prepare." "For what?" Wren's expression darkened. "For the final blow." 2 weeks later, the students of Graves' calculus class walked into the exam hall and immediately realized something was wrong. Instead of the usual exam papers, Each seat had a sealed black envelope. Graves stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is a special exam," he said smoothly. "It will determine whether you truly understand the essence of calculus or if you've simply memorized formulas like a machine." The students exchanged nervous glances. Barron stayed still. He knew what this was. A final test. A trap. Graves gestured toward the envelopes. "Inside, you will find only one problem. You have exactly 3 hours. Begin." The students opened their envelopes. Then, silence. Complete, stunned silence. Barron scanned the page. His stomach tightened. The problem wasn't just difficult. It was designed to be unsolvable in 3 hours. He looked around. Some students had already frozen, their pencils hovering over the paper, unsure where to begin. Others scribbled furiously, desperation in their eyes. Barron knew exactly what was happening. Graves had set them up to fail, and when they did, he would stand there and say, "You were never meant to be here." Barron tapped his pencil against the desk, thinking, "Change the rules." That's what Wren had taught him. Don't play the game. Rewrite it. Then an idea struck him. It was risky. It might not work. But it was the only way. Barron picked up his pen and started writing. Not the solution, not an attempt at solving the impossible problem, but a proof of why the problem itself was flawed. Instead of playing by Graves's rules, he exposed the trick. Minute by minute, he built his argument. He explained why the equation was misleading, how it created a paradox, and why it wasn't a test of intelligence, but a test of blind obedience. By the end of the 3 hours, his exam paper contained no numbers, just logic, just truth. The next day, Graves stood in front of the class, holding a stack of exams. His expression was unreadable. "No one," he said, "solved the problem correctly." No one moved. Graves slowly lifted one exam paper. "But," he continued, "one student understood the real purpose of the exam." Barron sat perfectly still. Graves held up his paper. And for the first time, the great Dr. Malcolm Graves did something no one had ever seen before. He smirked. Not a cruel smirk, not an arrogant one, but something else. Something like respect. Then he tore Barron's exam in half and dropped it into the trash. "The lesson is over," Graves said simply, and with that, he walked out. Barron watched him go, his mind racing. He had won. But he also knew one thing. Graves would never forget this, and neither would Barron. Because some battles aren't about victory. They're about proving you were never meant to lose. The moment Graves walked out of the classroom, the room erupted. Students turned to each other, whispering, some in shock, some in awe. "He actually did it," someone murmured. Barron sat still, absorbing what had just happened. Graves had acknowledged him, not with words, not with praise, but by tearing up his exam in front of the entire class. It wasn't an insult, it was a message. The battle between them was over, and Barron had won, but the consequences were just beginning. Later that evening, as Barron walked across campus, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Barron Trump?" a deep voice asked. "Yes. This is Dean Whitmore. Meet me in my office. Now." The call ended. Barron exhaled. This was coming sooner than expected. Dean Whitmore's office was on the top floor of the university's administration building, a large glass-paneled room that overlooked the entire campus. When Barron arrived, the door was already open. Inside, Whitmore sat behind his desk, his fingers interlocked, eyes sharp. And next to him, standing with his arms crossed, was Dr. Graves. Barron didn't flinch. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and took a seat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Whitmore exhaled through his nose and leaned forward. "You've made quite a mess," he said. Barron met his gaze. "I answered the exam honestly." Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "You humiliated one of the most respected professors at this institution." Barron didn't glance at Graves. He didn't need to. "I didn't humiliate him," Barron said. "I just didn't let him humiliate me." Whitmore leaned back. "You have powerful connections, Mr. Trump, but this university does not bend for anyone, not even you." Barron remained silent. Then for the first time since Barron entered, Graves spoke. "I'll admit," the professor said, his voice measured, "I underestimated you." Barron turned toward him. "I've broken students smarter than you," Graves continued. "Students with stronger backgrounds, better training. I pushed them to the edge, and they fell." He took a step forward. "But you didn't break." Barron didn't respond. Then something unexpected happened. Graves smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. "The world will try to break you, Trump," Graves said. "It will come at you from every angle, throw impossible tests at you, stack the deck against you." He paused. "And I needed to know if you could handle it." Barron frowned. "You're saying this was a test?" Graves's eyes glinted. "Everything is a test." Whitmore sighed. "Regardless of your little game, Graves, the fact remains. This situation is out of control." He turned to Barron. "We have donors. We have media attention. Your last name alone turns this into a political circus." Barron folded his arms. "So what happens now?" Whitmore was silent for a moment. Then he looked at Graves. Graves smirked. "Now?" the professor said. "You finish the class." For the rest of the semester, something strange happened. Graves and Barron no longer fought. Oh, the professor still pushed his students hard. He still called on Barron with difficult questions. But it wasn't personal anymore, because Graves now understood something. Barron wasn't just another privileged student. He was a fighter, and Graves respected that. When the final grades were posted at the end of the semester, Barron wasn't surprised to see his score. A plus, not because of his last name, not because of favoritism, but because he earned it. On the last day of class, as students filed out of the lecture hall, Graves stopped at his desk, flipping through papers. Barron approached him. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Graves spoke. "You're a stubborn kid," he said. Barron smirked. "You're a stubborn professor." Graves chuckled. "Maybe." He closed the folder on his desk. "Most people would have given up," Graves said. "You didn't." Barron met his gaze. "I don't break that easily." Graves nodded approvingly. Then as Barron turned to leave, the professor said one last thing. "If you ever want to study real mathematics, my door is open." Barron glanced back, surprised. Then he gave a small nod and walked out. The war was over, but the lesson would last forever. The semester ended, but the impact of Barron's battle with Dr. Graves remained. Students still whispered about it in the hallways. Professors still debated whether Barron had truly beaten Graves, or if the professor had orchestrated everything to test him. But Barron didn't care. He had learned something far more important than calculus. Strength isn't just about knowledge. It's about standing your ground when the world tries to knock you down. And that lesson would stay with him for life. A few weeks into winter break, Barron received an envelope in the mail. No return address, no markings, just his name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Congratulations, you passed the real test." At the bottom, in small, sharp handwriting, was one signature. "Dr. Malcolm Graves." Barron smirked. Of course. Graves wasn't one for sentimentality. He wasn't going to send a long message of praise. This was his way of acknowledging the fight. Barron folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He wouldn't forget Graves, and he knew, somewhere, somehow, their paths would cross again. Later that evening, Barron sat in his family's estate, looking over his future courses. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Professor Wren. "Come to my office. There's something you need to see." Curious, Barron drove to campus, where Wren sat waiting in his book-filled office. On the desk was an old mathematics journal, yellowed with age. "What's this?" Barron asked. Wren gestured for him to open it. Barron flipped through the pages. At first it was filled with equations, theorems, and mathematical theories. But as he reached the back, he noticed something strange. One of the pages was marked with a red pen. It was a theorem, one that looked eerily similar to the impossible problem Graves had given on the final exam. But this one was different, because it had been solved. Barron's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" Wren smiled. "This," he said, "is Graves' own work." Barron looked up. "You mean?" "Yes," Wren nodded. "Graves wasn't just testing you that day. He was giving you a problem he once tried to solve himself and failed. Barron's mind raced. That meant Graves had spent years searching for an answer. And when Barron refused to play by his rules, he had done something Graves never thought to do: challenge the question itself. Barron leaned back, processing everything. Then, Wren slid another envelope across the desk. "This arrived for you," he said. Barron opened it. Inside was a handwritten invitation. A private research group, elite mathematicians, global thinkers. At the bottom, written in bold ink, was the name of the man leading it, Dr. Malcolm Graves. Barron stared at it. Then he smirked. The battle was over, but the game had only just begun.